Hi everyone, in today's video we're going to take a look at what implementing an entire feature in an application that's built following CQRS, domain-driven design, and clean architecture, what it actually looks like. What I have now on the screen, this is from the very first video, and here's a lot of the technologies that we said that we're going to talk about and learn. Everything that's marked in green, then it's topics that we already covered, and there's still many great topics to talk about, especially Entity Framework Core. I know a lot of you are waiting for that, so don't worry, we're going to talk about that in depth, how we're going to bend Entity Framework Core to work with domain-driven design. It's not that trivial, but we have a lot of it out of the way. So what do we do now, right? So if you aren't familiar with the series or you haven't watched, then we're working on the Buber Dinner application. This is an application in which you can create dinners, invite people to dinners. And we did process modeling where we basically looked at what the entire flow from a timeline perspective, what it actually looks like, and the different commands that we have, events. This is only the start and end because it's pretty long. And now, how do we actually start? So what I like doing is taking all the various domain events, the ones that are more significant, and putting them one under the other. Now, of course, the first thing that you want to do before writing any code whatsoever is defining your API. Anyone involved that has a say needs to be part of this discussion, and having this contract that we have with the outside world sealed before we start writing any code. Now, if you're inventing your own protocol using REST or gRPC, doesn't matter. This is the first step. Once that we have that, then we can actually start implementing the features based on this roadmap that we have in whatever order that we see fit. So again, what we have on the screen are the main events based on their chronological order. And we now have some roadmap that we can follow while we're implementing our features. It makes sense that we, before implementing the dinner reserved flow, then we first want the user to be able to create a menu and a dinner and so on. So we already have this from the beginning of the series. Now we're using REST in our application. And what I did off camera is I defined all the various endpoints, what the requests look like, what the responses look like, what the resources are. So we have that out of the way, and now I'll just introduce it as we go along. So we already have this. Now we need to choose something from the beginning. So I decided for us to start with the flow of creating a menu. By the end of this video, other than having a check mark over here, then you'll have a good intuition into which logic goes into which layer. And this is playing together with all the technologies and theory that we learned up until this point. So looking at the flow of actually creating a menu, then the endpoint looks as following. So we have host/host ID/menus, and over here, the details of the menu. So the menu has sections, and each section has items, and each one of them has a name and a description. Now, we don't have the flow of a user becoming a host, so we're just going to skip that logic. We can look at this as the skeleton when we're starting to build our system. Then of course it isn't going to be complete, but it is what it is at this stage. So we send this to our system, and the response that the system returns is, if it was created successfully, of course, is 201 created. And also we have over here the details of what we created, including the various IDs. So this will be obviously not zeros in the actual response, and also some other stuff like average rating, and maybe the dinners that are associated with it. And of course, this will be empty in the actual response because this is the first time, so it doesn't have any reviews yet. Okay, moving on to which logic sits where. So inside the presentation layer in the contracts, we have our request and response schemas. Over here, this is the entrance to our application, the menus controller. Here we want to map the request to the corresponding command. Doing this conversion, we're going to use the menus mapping config because we're using Mapster. Then the request is sent to the mediator, and the mediator invokes the correct command handler. Again, we took the request and we mapped it to the corresponding command, and we have a validator with whatever validations that we want to do on the incoming request. Then using the menu repository, we want to store the menu that we just created in the database. So the interface sits over here in the application layer, but the actual implementation sits over here in the infrastructure layer. Then in our domain layer, then we have here the actual menu. This is from the previous video. So we created this together. This is just the definition of the menu. So I have a project open in Visual Studio Code, and because .NET 7 has been released, then I updated our project to use .NET 7, plus it was time for some project hygiene, so I introduced the Directory.Build.Props, and over here I put some common logic that we had in many of our projects, so we can remove the duplication across our solution. And also next time, now when we want to update our project, then all we need to do is bump it over here, and we don't need to go to each one of our projects. Also, one of the first things that I do in any project is I add various analyzers. StyleCop is the first analyzer that I add without thinking twice, so I would definitely recommend adding it. And if you do it in the beginning, then it helps you to align everyone across the team, and also for you or for me not to make mistakes while implementing it. Now, because we added it late in our project, then of course there's so many warnings, and because the warnings are treated as errors, so we have many errors. So of course, the first thing you're probably going to do afterwards is introduce the editor.config. And if you're not familiar with the command, then there's .NET new editor.config, which will create an editor.config file with a lot of common logic for .NET applications. Now notice that it creates it as the root editor.config. So if you're using this command somewhere in your tests or some inner project inside where you want it to have its specific rules or configurations, then you want to remove this line because it'll stop looking for the editor configs in the higher folders. Okay? Now, what I did is I suppressed a lot of the rules because we had a lot of warnings, a lot of errors. Don't take this as what you should do in your projects. Every project and every team has their specific rules, and I wouldn't do much of this in actual production applications. So now that we have that out of the way, the last thing I want to talk about is over here. I was thinking of doing an entire video about this, but I thought it might be too boring. So basically, we can't have the name of the class and the name of the namespace have anywhere subset of the same values. So if the name of our aggregate is dinner, then we can't have dinner anywhere in the namespace name. Now, because the default behavior is that the namespace name is based on the folder structure, then if our aggregate is called dinner, then we can't have any of the folders in the hierarchy anywhere leading to this aggregate have the word dinner in it. Now, there are multiple ways around this. I'm just doing a TLDR because I didn't do a video about this. So there are three main approaches to solve this. The first one is living with it just every time where you want to use the dinner aggregate, then disambiguating between the class name and the namespace name by writing dinner.dinner. The second approach is changing the folder name for there not to be an ambiguation anymore. So adding some suffix, be it aggregate or calling it dinners plural. And the third approach is giving some alias either to the class name or to the namespace name with global using directives. Then it's much easier. You can just do it in one place and it takes effect to the entire project. So choose whatever you want. I go with the aggregate suffix. Okay, so now that we have all of that out of the way, let's start implementing our menu. Okay, so we have here the API as we looked at before. This sits under the api.menu.markdown file. And what we did up until now with the authentication, then it sits under api.auth.markdown. And this is very similar to what we had with our aggregates. So we have aggregate.the specific aggregate for our domain models. And for our API, we have api.that_resource.markdown. So for the menu, let's put it over here so we have it while we're implementing. And let's make this a bit smaller so we have a bit more room. Inside the contracts project, let's create here a new folder. It's called menus. And inside here, let's create the create menu request. And over here, what we want is the create menu request. And what this has inside is let's leave the name in the description. And the last thing we want over here is a list of the menu sections. So let's say over here, list of menu section, and let's call it yes sections. And let's create this over here below. Let's say public record menu section, and over here we want the name, the description, and a list of yes menu items. Let's create this also, and over here we want only the name and the description, right? So let's paste it over here as following. Great, so this models one of these over here. Let's also define our response. So let's say over here menu response, and let's say public record menu response, yes, right? Take a look. We have the ID, the name, the description, and the average rating. So this is a float average rating. Yes, and we also have here let's call it menu section response, and let's define it over here. So let's say menu section response. Yes, let's give it the ID. The ID is a string, not a GUID. Let's change this over here as well. And we have also the menu item response, right? So ID, name, and description corresponds to this, and the menu item is one of these. So let's create this below. Let's say public record menu item response, which has an ID, a name, and a description. Great. The last thing that we're missing is these things over here. So let's create them. So we have our host ID, which is a string. We have a list of dinner IDs. We have a list of menu review IDs. And lastly, we have the created datetime and the updated datetime. So let's say datetime, created datetime, and updated datetime. Great. So now we have our request and response modeled over here inside the contracts project. So the next thing we want to do is go to our API project and under controllers, create here a new controller for the menu. So let's say here menus controller. And what we're going to have over here is, let's say, menus controller. And this inherits from the API controller, which I reminded you that this is the base controller for all of our controllers. And what we have over here is we require the user to be authenticated and authorized. And also we have the API controller attribute that does some magic for us. So back in our menus controller, then what we want to do is we want to add this endpoint over here. So what we want to do is, let's say over here that the route to this controller is the following. Let's say hosts/host ID / menus. Yes. I'm curious if GitHub Copilot is taking this string from this string. I wouldn't be surprised if yes. Okay, so we have that. Let's say over here, HTTP post, and let's say public action result, create menu, and let's say over here that this receives the create menu request, and also we have the host ID from the route. Great, so we have this. Let's define it. So for now, let's just say return okay and the request. Let's make sure that everything here is wired together and it's defined the way we want. I think this has the wrong namespace. Let's see if this solves it. Yes. So let's run this, make a request, see that this works as we expect, and that we have this basic infrastructure wired together. So I'm closing this and let's run our application. So done it, run. Yes, the Buber Dinner API. Great, we're running inside the requests folder. Let's create here a new folder. Let's call it menus. And inside here, let's create the create menu request, which let's just copy one of these for reference. And let's split the screen and open the menu API definition on the right so we can copy from it. Let's copy the route and put it over here. Let's put the host prefix. Then we have the host ID. We want this to be as a parameter. And then we have the menus. Then we have the request itself. So I'm copying it from the API definition that we looked at before, pasting it on the left. And the last thing that we're missing over here is the authorization. So this is bearer. And over here, we need the token. So let's try making the request and seeing that if it actually works. So making the register request, then we have a token that now we can use. Let's go over here, create a token variable. Let's paste the token over here. Let's make some more room. And lastly, we have the host ID. So let's create the host ID. And for now, let's just put here some junk. Okay, so we have everything we need. Let's make the request and see if this actually works. So we send the request, we get a response, and the response is just like the request, meaning that we wired it together. Great, so now back in the menus controller, then we have over here the request and the host ID. What we want to do is create the corresponding command that we're going to send to the mediator, which will invoke the create menu command handler. So let's go ahead and create that in the application layer. So in the application layer, let's create a new folder. Let's call it menus. And inside here, let's create the commands folder. And inside, let's create the create menu folder, which internally will have the create menu command and the create menu command handler. So starting with the command, then let's say over here, public record create menu command. And what we have over here is similar to this. Let's accept it. So let me split the screen, open the menu request on the right so we can copy from it. And let's actually copy this entire thing, paste it over here, and let's change the names to create menu command. And let's basically add command suffix to each one of the other ones. So let's say both over here, and now let's change this to be menu item command and menu section command. Great, let me close what's on the right and let's recap. So we have our create menu command, which is what we're going to send, and it's going to be handled by the handler. And you might be asking yourself, why are we duplicating the requests again exactly the way it looks before? Because what we're going to do with this command is we're going to create the menu. So now we have 3 different copies of the menu. We have the menu request in the contracts, we have the menu command in the application layer, and we have the menu aggregate in the domain layer. So the reason for that is that currently we're working on the first version of our API. It's not uncommon that suddenly 2 properties become 1 property becomes 2 properties, a property's name changes, or maybe a new nullable property is added. So there are all these different scenarios that what this allows us to do is to update the API freely. And then all we need to do is update the conversion from the API definition to the command definition. And that's it. All the rest of the logic stays the same. The command handler can stay the same and so on. And if we have to change the command handler, then again, we don't need to change the aggregate. And in the end of the day, it allows each layer to grow and morph on its own without having to worry about the other layers. And all we need to update is how the data is passed from between the layers and how it's converted. Now, it's not ideal. Of course, there's a lot of duplication, a lot of boilerplate, and changing one property means changing sometimes the exact same thing in a few models. It's not ideal. It has its pros and cons, and there are many approaches. This is what I'm presenting over here, but you can definitely only create the command and then use this as your API definition, but you're losing some of the flexibility. So you need to choose what the correct thing is for you based on your preference and so on. Okay, let's continue. Right, so here we have our command. The last thing that we're missing is, of course, implementing the iRequest interface to define that it's a MediatR request and also to define the return type. So let's say iRequest, and this returns error or the menu. So let's add the namespace. And now let's move on to the command handler. So over here, let's say public class create menu command handler. This implements the iRequest handler for the create menu command and the error or menu, right? So this is the command and this is the return type of the command. So let's just add the error or namespace. And let's implement this interface. So here we have the method, we have our create menu command. Over here, the logic that we want is to create the menu itself. Then we want to persist the menu, and then we want to return the menu. So for now, I'm going to cheat. That's because I first want to make sure that the conversion from the create menu request and host ID to the create menu command work successfully. So I'm just going to say over here, for now, return default, and that's it. So back in the menu controller, then what we have over here, we have the request and the host ID. We have this pair. We want to convert it now to the create menu command that we just created. So what we want to have over here is command. And what we want to do is we want to use the Mapster library to do this conversion for us. So let's say private read-only mapper, and let's create the corresponding constructor. And let's say over here that we want to take our mapper and we want to map the request and the host ID to the create menu command that we just defined. Now, of course, this conversion out of the box won't just work. That's because the names of the properties aren't the same. So we need to do some configurations. So this sits under common, under mapping, and over here, we want to create a mapping config for the menu. So let's say menu mapping config, and this is going to be similar to the authentication mapping config that we already have over here. So let's go over here and let's say public class menu mapping config, and this is going to implement the iRegister interface from Mapster. Let's implement this interface, and over here we have the config that now we can configure our mappings. So let's say config.newConfig, and again we want a mapping from the request and the host ID to the command. So let's say over here, create menu request, and let's call it request. Then let's say string host ID, and we're mapping it to the create menu command. Yes, this one. And what we want to say is the following. We have the host ID from the request. We want to pass it to the command. So because we don't have this property yet, I forgot about it. Then let's add it over here. Let's say string host ID, and now our command has all the information we need. So now let's say in the destination, the host ID comes from the source.host ID. So again, the source is this tuple over here of the request and the host ID. So we're saying that the property that we just added in the command, this is populated by the source.host ID, which is this property over here. And what we want to do also is to say that all the rest of the properties in the command comes simply from the request, because we just did copy paste. So all the rest of the properties have the same names, so we don't need any special configuration. So what we can do is simply say in the destination, all the rest of the properties take it from the request, and that's it. That should be enough. So back in our controller, now we have this. We can send the command to the mediator. So we can say create menu result equals to, and we want to send this to the mediator, which we don't yet have. So let's say I sender mediator, and let's include the namespace, add this to the constructor, and now we can use it over here. We can say mediator.send the command. Of course, we want to await the response. So let's make this entire thing async, and that's it. Let's put a breakpoint over here. Let's build the project, make a request, make sure that everything works up until this point, and then we can continue. So let's say let it build. First of all, let's see if it builds successfully. No, so we have an error in the menu mapping config, and yeah, it's because of the analyzer. So let's say over here, let's get rid of the last empty line. Let's try building again. Great, let's run the project and let's make the request. So back over here, we want first to attach the debugger because we want to hit the breakpoint. So let's attach the debugger to the Buber Dinner application, and the debugger is attached. Let's make the request, and we hit the breakpoint. We have our request over here with all the values that we supplied, and let's see if the mapping works as we expect. So yes, we have here the command with everything that we want. Let's put a breakpoint also in our command handler and make sure that we arrive here successfully. Let's continue, and we arrive over here. We have here the request with all the values. So now we can implement actually creating the menu and persisting it to our in-memory database that we haven't yet created. Okay, back in the create menu command handler, then let's go ahead and create the menu. So let's say over here, menu equals menu.create. And I'm reminding you that we're still missing a lot of the bare minimum, the enforcing the invariance inside the menu, which can return either an error or the menu. We're also missing validation on the properties of the request. So we're still missing a lot of this. We're just doing the skeleton, the minimum that we can get this entire thing to work as a feature across our entire project. Then as we add more of this stuff, then of course we'll need to change this and refactor it. This is just a step along the way. So let's accept the suggestion and let's see what we're missing. So I'm going to split it. I'm going to open the menu aggregate on the right, and I want to go to the create method. So we see the values one next to each other. So we have the host ID coming from the request host ID, we have the name coming from the request name, and we have the description coming from the request description. The next thing is the list of menu sections. So we want to take the sections and convert them to a menu section. So let's go ahead and fix the code over here so it compiles. So we have the menu section. We want to create it based on the name and the description. And we have the item that we want to also create based on the name and the description. So again, each menu section has a name, a description, and a list of items. And every menu has a name, a description, and a list of sections. Okay, what we're missing over here is, of course, this is just a string. We want to create the corresponding host ID. So let's say over here, host ID dot create, and let's pass it this thing. And now this entire thing should work. Let's add over here the argument names so it's a bit more readable. And every time we have select and then to list, then we can simply use convert all instead. So let's get rid of this to list and this to list. And let's say over here, convert all, and same goes over here. Great. So we have this. It's a bit ugly, I know, but again, this is just a step in the way. It's not going to look like this at all. Once we continue and we add all the error handling, this is just a step in the way. So now we want to persist the menu. Then for that, we need to create the iMenu repository interface. So back in our, let's close all this so it's a bit more organized and you can see where we are. So inside the application project, we have the common folder, and inside the interfaces, we define the various interfaces that are implemented by the infrastructure layer. What we want to do is inside the persistence folder, create here the iMenu repository, which will define the interface for the menu repository, which will be implemented in the infrastructure layer. So what we're going to have over here is public interface iMenu repository, and we're going to have one method for now. Let's just call it add, pass it the menu. Yes, this isn't asynchronous. We're working in memory. We'll refactor this when we get to the persistence section in future videos. So now that we have the interface, then what we can do over here is use it. So let's make a bit more room. Let's close this and make this a bit smaller. Okay, so private read-only iMenu repository, menu repository, and let's create the corresponding constructor. And now let's call the add method. So let's say menu repository, add, let's pass it the menu, and finally, let's return over here the menu. Great, we have all of this. And so this menu can be converted to the error or menu. We're going to cheat again. For now, we're just going to say over here, async task, and we're going to wait a completed task. So this entire thing is synchronous, and now this conversion works. So again, we created the menu, we're adding it to the database, and we're returning it over here. Now, of course, we haven't implemented this iMenu repository yet, so nothing's going to work. So what we want to do is back in the infrastructure layer, let's go ahead to the persistence and create here the menu repository. So public class menu repository. This is going to implement the iMenu repository. And over here, let's implement the add method, which will simply take the menu aggregate and store it in the in-memory list of menus. So let's say over here, private read-only list of menu, and let's call it menus. And because we're going to create this as scoped, then let's say static, so it always uses the same list. And we're going to say menus.add, and we're going to add the menu. Great. So we have this implementation. Let's wire everything together in the dependency injection file of the infrastructure layer. So we already have this thing over here where we're adding the user repository. We're going to do something similar, but let's extract it to a method so it's a bit more organized. So let's create here a new method, and let's call it add persistence. And what we're going to have over here is a method that basically does this, right? We have the user repository, and we want to do the same thing for the menu repository. So let's say menu repository, and let's finally return the services from over here. Now all we need to do is call it. So let's say add persistence, and that's it. Okay, so Just to recap again what we have, then we have the contracts project, which has the definition for creating a new menu and returning it. Then we have the menus controller, which has the endpoint for creating a new menu, and the path contains the host ID, which is captured in this parameter over here. Then what we're doing is we're taking the create menu request and the host ID, we're mapping it to the create menu command. We're sending this command to the mediator, which invokes the create menu command handler, which internally, all it does is it creates the menu, it adds it to the repository, and it returns it over here. The last thing we still need to do is take this result that we have and return the correct response, whether it's the menu or some error that occurred. Okay, so we have the created menu result, and what we want to do is match on what we got. If we got the menu, then we want to say, yes, created at action, and we'll fix this in a second. Otherwise, we have the list of errors, and we want to return a problem and pass it the list of errors. This is again a method that we defined in our custom base controller in previous videos. I'll link it over here, the corresponding video where we explain about it. So if you find that interesting, then you can check it out. What we're missing over here is the get menu method that the client can now use to fetch the menu that they just created. What the framework does in this method is it takes the values that we provide and it creates the URL that'll populate in the location header that the client can now use to fetch the value, and then it's routed to the corresponding get menu method. But because we're not going to do that as part of this video, then for now, let's simply say, okay, and let's map the menu to the menu response. So we have our mapper. Let's map the menu to the menu response, and we need to define this mapping as well. So back in our menu mapping config, let's add this mapping. So let's say mapping new config, yes, from the menu to the menu response. Okay, now in this mapping, everything is trivial other than the IDs and the average rating. So in the IDs, if you remember, it's a value object and the property itself sits under id.value. So let's look at what this actually looks like. So let's say over here, map, and we want to say that in the destination, the ID comes from the source and it comes from the id.value. Yes, great. And the same thing for the mapping between the menu section and the menu section response. So yes, same thing. And it's complaining because this comes from the contract and not from the aggregate. So to disambiguate, let's say over here that the menu section comes from the aggregate entity menu section. Yes, it's following. Then the menu section now refers to the menu section from our domain layer and not from the contract. And last, we have our item. So very similar. Let's change this to item and here as well. And same drill. Let's disambiguate that the item is the item. Great. Next, we have the average rating. So let's say over here that in the destination, the average rating comes from the source average rating dot value. Okay. And lastly, we have the host ID, the dinner IDs, and the menu review IDs. So let's say map destination, and we want the host ID to come from the source host ID dot value. Yes. Next, we have the dinner IDs. So let's say map destination dot dinner IDs, and this comes from source dot dinner IDs. And here we can simply select the value. And very similar to this, let's say that we want the menu review IDs to come from the menu review IDs, and we want to select from the menu ID, the menu ID dot value. Great, let's add the closing brackets, and that is it. So again, what we have over here is the configuration to map from the menu to the menu response. There are better ways to write what we wrote over here, but because this video has a lot of details already in it, then I'm going to leave it as is, just so it works and we have a working solution end to end. So let's build application, make sure that this works as we expect. Great, let's run the project and let's do the create menu. This was deleted, so I rewrote it, but I forgot to say create menu. So create menu, and what we're missing is to attach the debugger. So let's attach it to the Buber Dinner application. Let's make sure we have the breakpoint in the controller. So yes, we have the breakpoint. Let's make the request and let's see if everything works as we expect. So we mapped the request to the command. Let's make sure that this worked as we expect. Great. Then we have our create menu command handler. Let's put a breakpoint over here and let's continue. Then we're creating the menu. So this mapped the menu command to the menu aggregate. And then we're adding it to the in-memory list of menus that the menu repository has. So we can see that, yes, it was added successfully. And then if we continue, I want us to arrive back over here. So we have our create menu result, and we see that the value really is the menu aggregate that we just created. Now we want to map it to the menu response. So we click continue, and let's look at the response and make sure that this looks the way we expect it to look. So indeed, we have everything we want. Here's the host ID that we passed in the request. And of course, these are empty because nothing exists there yet. We have the created datetime and the updated datetime, which are invalid. This is something that we need to fix in the future. But other than that, everything works as we expect. Okay, so final recap of what we have. Then we created the create menu request. We defined the way it looks over here in the contracts project. Then we created the menus controller that receives the request and uses the menu mapping config to do the conversion between the application layer and the response over here, right? So it does this mapping between the layers. And in the application layer, we created the menu. This should be menus, plural. Then we created over here the menu command handler. And I forgot to do the validator. I'll do it in a future video. I'm too tired to do it today. I just now noticed that I forgot it, so I'll do it in the next time. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so I'm here from the future. Too bad Amichai from the past was too lazy to do it, and I need to film this part again. So again, what we have is we implemented the command and the command handler, and we're still missing the create menu command validator. This is using FluentValidation. If you haven't watched the video, then I'll link it over here so you can catch up and come back to this part. So let's do that now. This should be pretty quick. So again, inside the application layer, over here, we created the menus, and over here we have the create menu. We have the command and the command handler. What we're missing is the validator. So let's go ahead and create it. Create menu command validator. And what we're going to want over here is the create menu command validator, which will implement the abstract validator. Yes. And let's make sure that the right thing is here. So yes, this is the command that we want to validate. And over here, we have whatever rules that we want. So we can say rule 4, and let's say that the name is not empty. Let's say same thing for the description. And let's say that also the sections, I don't know, is not an empty list. Okay, something like that. Just for now, let's make sure that this is wired together. So let's build the application. Great. Let's run the application. Let's make the create menu request, and let's put here something invalid based on the rules that we just defined. Let's make the request, and we get unauthorized. That's because the token is valid for 1 hour, and it's been multiple since I did this. So let's make the register request. Let's take the token from here, and let's paste it over here. And let's make the request again. And we get here the error name must not be empty, like we said. Let's also get rid of the description, make sure that this is applied. Yes, and also for the sections, we said that it can't be empty. So yes, that's it. That's how simple it is to add validation to our command. Now, of course, these aren't the actual rules that we're going to have in the end. We're going to have something a bit more interesting, but I want to make a video specifically on validation. What's the difference between domain validation, request validation, what's its where? If you have things that are validated twice, then how do you decide what rule to put where? So there's some stuff to talk about. This is something interesting, and there are a few approaches, so I want to present it in a more holistic way. So for now, this is just to see what logic sits where. So back to the overview. Then now we have everything that we talked about. We have the iMenu repository interface over here, which is actually implemented in the infrastructure layer. And here we wired some stuff together in the dependency injection. And over here, we have our aggregate that we just used to actually create the aggregate and store it in memory. If you want the source code of what we wrote today and all my past videos and the next videos as they come out, then do consider supporting me on Patreon. It's $5. You get everything. And of course, it allows me to take more time off work and work on the channel. So I think that's it for now. I know this video was a lot and we covered a lot of things that we talked about in the past. So we did them in this video and I might have talked too fast or too much. So I apologize if this was hard to follow. So that's it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it and you learned something new. Again, this is more about which logic sits in what layer. And if you're working in an application that's built similar to this, then I hope it gives you the intuition to understand how to actually start, how to do it in a way that's incremental, and you can see that things are working and wired together as you go along. So if you liked it, then make sure to smash that like button, and I'll see you in the next one.